Decap Attack, Decap Attack, Decap Attack, not magical hat, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh.
Whoa, what's the big idea?
Shut up.
Released for the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive in 1991, Decap Attack is a 2D platformer that was developed by Vic Tokai. It was actually originally released in Japan as a licensed title based on the Magical Hat series before getting assets swapped and reworked to better fit Western sensibilities, which apparently meant making it spooky. The game follows a living mummy named Chuck Da Head, not to be mistaken with the rapper Chuck D's Head, as he tries to defeat a demon named Max Decap, who's escaped from the underworld with an army of monsters to wreak havoc on the planet. Decap Attack received some fairly decent reviews when it first came out, with critics more or less stating that the game was more unique for its horror theming than anything, and that the gameplay itself was fairly by the numbers for the Genesis, even in 1991. For example, my personal favorite review of the game by the German magazine ASM stated that Decap Attack was, quote, very similar to Sonic the Hedgehog and Castle of Illusion, and also that the playability and controls, quote, left little to be desired. They also happen to refer to platformers as jump and runs, which is kind of amazing and totally how I'm gonna refer to the genre from now on. It is kinda perfect after all, you do literally jump and run in these games. While I've never personally played through Decap Attack before, I'm aware that the game has its fans, and it does look like it's one of those games that Sega likes to pull out of the woodwork whenever they're re-releasing their library on a new platform. As of the making of this video, Decap Attack is available on the current Sega Genesis Classics collection on Nintendo Switch, PS4, and Xbox One, as a solo purchase on the PC version of that same collection, for free with ads on mobile, and on the Xbox 360 and PS3 Genesis compilation too, making it one of the more widely available releases for Sega's 16-bit hardware. But does it hold up? Because while it's widely available, was good enough to warrant an asset swap to begin with, and has its fans, none of that necessarily guarantees that it's all that great of a game. And while I'm a sucker for the macabre and playful aesthetic that this game's got going for it, I also don't know if that's enough to make me want to recommend this game over other similarly themed titles. Before we continue though, a quick question of the day. Do you have any favorite games to play in the fall, and if so, what are they? I have a handful of games that I always seem to want to replay this time of the year, such as any installment in the Halo franchise, Telltale's excellent Back to the Future game, or just about any open-world Spider-Man game. In the case of the Halo franchise, I think it's because I first played through Combat Evolved in the fall when I was a kid, and have coincidentally enough ended up playing through each subsequent Halo game that I've bought around that time of the year too. There's also the fact that in the fall of my freshman year of college, I ended up rediscovering how much I loved Halo 3's multiplayer with my friends, and we'd literally spend our nights playing split-screen matchmaking as we made our way through Led Zeppelin's discography at the same time. Be sure to leave your answer to the question of the day over in the comments. I'd love to hear your answer. And if you don't have a game that you catch yourself replaying in the fall, feel free to just tell me a bit about a game that you've been or are looking forward to playing or something. And with that out of the way, on with the video. Decap Attack's original Magic Hat incarnation was the third game produced by Vic Tokai to feature a style of jump and run action that's similar to what's on display here. Because I found this out just before starting my initial playthrough, I somewhat expected that Decap Attack would be a relatively polished and refined experience. To which I say,
maybe not.
Thanks.
Decap Attack kinda feels like a fusion of different ideas and tropes used across games in the genre that are sometimes iterated on and adapted to great effect, but still leaves a bit to be desired in other areas of the game in the process. The game is spread out across 7 different levels that each contain 3 stages and a boss within them. Despite the fact that the main objective of each of these stages is ultimately focused around reaching a goalpost and moving on to the next one, the stages themselves offer a few simple twists to that basic gameplay in order to help keep things fresh. For starters, the game features a few auto-scrolling levels that are actually pretty fun. While I usually don't have anything against auto-scrollers, there's no denying that they can often be a bit of a chore to play through, but Decap Attack actually does a pretty good job of keeping them fun due to offering multiple paths for you to hop between while the screen moseys to the right at a snail's pace. And for the third stage of each level, they tend to stand out due to featuring a boss battle at the end of them and an item that needs to be collected in order to exit the stage. And despite my being slightly against forced exploration in a 2D jump and run, Vic Tokai actually did a pretty good job of placing those items in obvious enough areas for players to find them without always needing to resort to backtracking. And even if you did need to backtrack, the levels themselves are mostly linear in their layouts, meaning that it's nearly impossible to get lost.
Oh, I'm hopelessly lost!
And while one could argue that it's bad game design to force players on a quest to find some arbitrary MacGuffin, I actually think it's kinda clever. You see, Decap Attack also happens to feature a pretty robust set of items that can be accessed with the A button, and can prove to really come in handy during regular stages or during boss battles. And in order to collect these power-ups, you'll need to break open these shrunken head statues that are scattered throughout each of the stages. Oh, and you can also get extra items through these bonus stages that you can play at the end of each level, but that's not really important right now. These statues also include a skull that Decap Attack's official comic strip creatively named Head, because I suppose Scully was just a bit too on the nose, health pickups, and as the game progresses, enemies that can sneak in an easy hit or two if you aren't careful. The reason I bring this up is that forcing the player to explore and break statues for each level's McMuffin accomplishes the goal of adequately arming the player for their adventure. It's certainly not perfect, but when you look at it that way, this fairly unsubtle bit of hand-holding on the developer's part is actually kinda thoughtful and justified in being there.
Leave me! Go, 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 go! And wow, thanks!
Plus, using the items themselves is totally optional, so it's not even like you need to use them. They're just there to make the adventure a tiny bit easier, just like how you could select to start the game with an extra literal heart of health from the options screen. This all kinda gets at what I was referring to earlier when I said that the game successfully builds off other titles in the genre while also leaving a bit to be desired. Because Decap Attack is the third and a half, if you count the Magical Hat version, game in this mold from Vic Tokai, the game features some design elements and choices that have clearly resulted from learning from previous experiences and studying the competition. And in that regard, Decap Attack is actually a really polished and forward-thinking game. Aside from the fact that some of its cornerstone mechanics can feel a bit rough around the edges. For starters, the game's movement is interesting to say the least. Chuck Ahead's a pretty spry guy when push comes to shove, and can quickly build up an admirable amount of speed once he's given a head start. However, he also happens to be a bit slippery to control and ends up sliding around a bit when you try to come to a complete stop, which can be a bit disorienting at first and could lead to you taking some damage from enemies if you aren't careful. But thankfully, the levels are mostly designed around this, so it's never really that big of an issue and stands as more of a unique quirk that the game has as opposed to an actual flaw. I think that the best way to describe his movement here is that it's kinda stylized and modeled after some of the tropes you might find in a Chuck Jones era Looney Tunes cartoon. Which kinda makes sense now that I think about it. I mean, even his name feels somewhat modeled after the likes of characters like Wile E. Coyote. Anyway, while the slippery movement isn't a flaw in and of itself, it can sometimes come across as being a little unpolished, even if it was consciously added and deliberated over by the developers. When it comes to platformers, it's imperative to the gameplay that players feel in control of, well, the platforming. After all, it's the central crux of the experience. In order to feel comfortable jumping and running, one must first feel confident in those mechanics. And thankfully, Decap Attack succeeds at this for the most part, despite its acceleration and deceleration feeling a bit off for my liking. It also helps that the game features a projectile attack in the form of that skull power-up I mentioned earlier though, as it seriously comes in handy for clearing out enemies while you're zipping through a stage. Plus, the attack actually continues to damage enemies that walk over it while it's on the ground, and even works a bit like a boomerang that returns to you after a couple of seconds. You can also perform a flutter jump that's similar to Yoshi's, or that one attack Bonk has that allows Chuck to control his descent speed and reposition himself to get away from baddies. It's an interesting way to work around some of the issues I have with the game's movement for sure, and it comes in handy pretty often and makes me feel like a bit of a jerk for calling him slippery to begin with.
Gee, I never thought of it like that. Do you think I hurt old Chuck's feelings?
In fact, I honestly found myself avoiding confrontations with enemies unless it was necessary due to Chuck's standard attack doing little to instill me with confidence. I just felt like its accuracy left something to be desired due to a few too many situations where I took damage after just barely missing an enemy. Much like how your flutter jump helps remedy the issues I had with the game's movement though, Decap Attack does allow you to stun and kill some enemies by jumping on them Mario style, which is pretty handy. Overall though, Decap Attack's gameplay is relatively solid. While I did have issues with Chuck Dahead's movement, the game's level layouts helped with it by curbing that slight road bump into being more of a harmless design quirk than anything. On top of that, the game was actually pretty generous when it came to giving you items to help with the game's combat, and Decap Attack's bosses all tended to be relatively easy anyway. It isn't perfect, and there are some things that I find a bit unnecessary in the game, like the fact that you don't regain health between stages, but Decap Attack is a fun enough gameplay experience nonetheless. But now on to one of my favorite aspects of the game, its visuals. Decap Attack's art style is right up my alley and is loaded to the brim with kooky and macabre designs and presentation that feel decidedly 90s. Its characters look like they were freshly plucked out of concept art for Real Monsters. I'm pretty sure I've seen this game's entire color palette in a ZooBooks commercial before, and it also has strange and wonderful details like how every enemy you kill explodes into several bones, even when it doesn't make sense for them to have bones in the first place. Like seriously, jellyfish and ghosts shouldn't have bones, right?
Maybe, maybe not.
Okay.
At any rate, Decap Attack's art style heavily leans on the cartoony side to great effect. It's also actually really impressive how cohesive things feel in this game too, given its background as a reworked title from Japan. And while it does feature a lot of original art, some original assets did manage to make it into the final American release and fits in pretty inconspicuously. It's not always perfect, and some of these designs can sometimes lean on the verge of being offensive though. A pretty decent example of this is the somewhat casual implication that Native American totems or inhabitants of islands are the tools and allies of Max Dahead, who's supposed to be a literal demon. But on a design level, the game's sprites and characters are all relatively solid. And while Decap Attack's color palette is a bit too earthy for me personally, it is theoretically sound and does look great in motion thanks to some really impressive parallax scrolling. However, the visuals pale in comparison to Decap Attack's phenomenal soundtrack. The game's soundtrack is a madcap combination of video gamey jingles and macabre jamming that, at any given moment, can go from reminding me of something like Capcom's DuckTales soundtrack to the likes of Oingo Boingo. And I know I've made that comparison twice before and that they were also coincidentally for spooky games, but this rings especially true in the case of Decap Attack. I mean, the title song for this game directly reminds me of their song Forbidden Zone. It's actually almost eerie how similar parts of the song feel. And yeah, that's somehow the second time I've compared a game's music to that song specifically, and I swear that was actually a total accident. Regardless, my constant comparisons to Danny Elfman's awesome new wave ska band is probably the highest compliment I can pay a game trying to do what Decap Attack does though. I'd honestly go as far as to say that Decap Attack has one of my favorite non-Sonic Genesis soundtracks because of how it manages to feel epic and playful at the same time. Plus, its inventory theme is just pretty awesome. So does Decap Attack hold up?
Maybe, maybe not.
Give me that thing.
Despite feeling a bit unpolished at times, Decap Attack is a solid jump and run that's helped by its great visuals and music. And while there are a bunch of great cartoony horror or Halloween adjacent games out there, I personally found that Decap Attack is worth a playthrough or two every fall. And while I get how underwhelming a maybe may sound, it's honestly the best way I can surmise my feelings on the game because Decap Attack is a good game, as my review is clearly stated, but I just don't know whether or not it's good enough to go out of your way to play. However, at the same time, players looking for something like this really won't have to look that hard for it due to it being readily available on every modern platform. Ultimately, even though I'm kinda torn over whether or not I'd say that this game holds up, I definitely find myself leaning a bit more towards recommending this to fans of the genre or anyone looking for a good cartoony 16-bit game to get spooky to. It isn't great, but it's certainly not bad, and you could do a lot worse. So if you need something more definitive than a maybe, I guess you could just take my answer as to whether or not Decap Attack holds up as being a fairly tentative yes. Anyway, with that said and done, that brings us to the end of this video. Feel free to like, comment, or subscribe if you enjoyed it, and feel free to leave an answer to the question of the day if you haven't already. On top of that, feel free to share a recommendation for a game you'd like to see reviewed in a future video, and feel free to hit me up on social media. You can find me on Twitter or Instagram by searching for @NichePlays on those respective platforms, or by following the links down in the description. So to cap things off, I hope you enjoyed this video, and that if you do decide to play through Decap Attack for the first time, or that if you just happen to play through it again since it's October and all, that you have a great time doing so. So yeah, bye.